I have set more bones in this valley than I can rightly count, and I have buried my share too. And if you sat me down by my own stove and asked which of all of it I'd keep, I'd tell you it was the morning I watched a hard-luck cowboy come riding back into Quillen after 7 years gone. Sure in his bones he'd find the woman he loved laid low. And the way his whole face came apart when he saw her instead, up on the box of a freight wagon with the lines in her two strong hands, hollering at a man twice her size to get the off-leader hitched before she did it herself. But I am ahead of myself. A doctor learns to go slow. Let me start where the trouble started, which was the spring the green colt put Della Hartwell down in the dust of her father's lot, and the whole town decided between one breath and the next that her life was over. It was not over. I want that plain before another word. It was the town that was wrong, every soul of it, myself near included, and it took us years to learn how wrong. She was 19 that spring, Della was, and she rode like she'd been poured onto a horse instead of born to a wheelwright. Old Sam Hartwell built wheels and wagons at the edge of Quillen, the truest wheels in 3 counties, and he raised his girl in the shavings and the heat of the forge, and she could gentle a horse nobody else would put a saddle on. The colt that threw her was one of those, a long-legged blue roan with a mean eye that 3 grown men had given up on. Della took him because Della took the ones nobody else would. That was always her way. She got him soft as butter inside a week, and on the 9th day a rattler buzzed up out of the rocks by the Tully Fork, and the roan came undone all at once, and he went over backward on the hardpan with her under him. I was there inside the hour. I will not dwell on it. It is enough to say her back was hurt low down, and her legs, that had gripped 1,000 horses, went still and stayed still. I told Sam Hartwell the truth, which a doctor owes a man even when it cuts him in half. She would live, and she would not walk again, and the rest of what her life would be was up to her, and to God, and to nobody in this town who pitied her. The pitying started before she was even out of her fever. You would not believe how fast a town can fold a young woman up and put her on a shelf. By the time Della Hartwell was sitting up and taking broth, the good women of Quillen had already decided her story for her. Poor thing, such a waste, and her so pretty and so quick. They'd lower their voices when they said it, the way you do over a coffin. They brought casseroles. They brought sympathy thick as molasses, and underneath the sympathy, though not a one of them would have owned it, was a kind of relief, that it was her and not their own girls, and that the wild gifted Hartwell girl who'd outridden and outshone every one of them was finally brought down to where they could feel sorry for her instead of small beside her. And there was Reese Calloway, gone west 3 weeks before it happened. Now I should tell you about Reese, because he is half of this, and because for 7 years he was a ghost in our town whether he knew it or not. He was a drover's son with no land and no name to speak of, and he and Della had grown up half-wild together along the Caldera Road, and any fool with eyes could see what was between them by the time they were grown. But Reese had nothing, and he was proud the way a man with nothing is proud, and he'd taken it into his head that he'd not come courting Sam Hartwell's daughter with empty hands. So he hired onto a big drive headed for the railheads and beyond, and the last thing he did before he rode out was stand in the wheel lot with his hat in his hands, and tell Della he'd be back inside 2 years with money in his pocket and a question on his lips. She told me about it once, years on. She said she'd told him she didn't need him to be rich. She said he'd grinned that crooked grin and said it wasn't for her, it was for him, that a man had to be able to look his wife's father in the eye. She said she'd let him go because she was 19 and certain, the way you're only certain at 19, that 2 years was nothing and the world was kind. The world was not kind. 3 weeks later the roan put her down, and the letters, there'd been letters the first month smelling of trail dust in far-off places, full of his terrible spelling and his big plans. The letters stopped that winter, just stopped. Word drifted back the way word does, third and fourth hand. A hard winter on the high plains, a wagon train caught out, men lost. Then later, vaguer, a war pulling men in down south. Then nothing at all. By the second year, even Sam Hartwell had stopped going to the post on stage days. By the third, the town had buried Reese Calloway as neat as they'd shelved his sweetheart, and they'd married the two facts together into one sad story they liked to tell, the crippled Hartwell girl and the cowboy who never came back. And they shook their heads over it and felt the sweetness of their own pity, and they were wrong about every single part of it. Because here is what they missed, sitting in their parlors being sorry. While they pitied her, Della Hartwell was building something none of them could have built with two good legs and a tailwind. It began with the chair. Old Sam, who had not said 10 words since the accident that weren't about the accident, went silent into his shop one night and did not come out for 4 days, and what he carried out at the end of it was a thing of beauty. He'd taken his truest, lightest buggy wheels, the slim ones he made for the doctor's gigs, for my own gig, as it happened, and he'd built his daughter a chair on them. Cane seat, ash frame steamed and bent smooth as a fiddle, a brake lever to her right hand, the big wheels set so she could drive them herself, and the whole thing balanced so fine she could spin it in its own length on the plank floor. He'd built her a horse she could ride sitting down. And when he rolled it up to her bed and she put her hands on the rims and pushed herself across the room and back, the first thing she did in 7 weeks that wasn't crying or sleeping, she looked up at her father and at me standing in the door, and she laughed. Not a brave little laugh. A real one, the old one, the one that used to carry across the wheel lot. "Well," she said, "now I've got wheels truer than anything on this road. Get out of my way, the both of you." We got out of her way. We have been getting out of her way ever since. Sam died the next winter, his heart quick in his sleep, a mercy as those things go, and he left her the shop and the lot and a name good for credit at every supply house from Quillen to the railhead. The town waited in that sorry way to see who'd take the poor Hartwell girl in. A spinster aunt, maybe. The county home whispered the very worst of them. Della Hartwell sold the wheel shop's tools to her father's best journeyman, kept the patents and the name, and bought the broken-down stage station out at Larkspur Crossing, where the Caldera Road forded the Tully. Larkspur Crossing was a wreck when she bought it. The stage company had near given up on it, bad water, a sagging barn, a station master who watered the whiskey and the horses both. The company men laughed when her offer came in. A woman. A cripple, they said, the way men say a thing they think is clever. They sold it to her cheap to be rid of it, and they put it about that they'd give it a season. I want to tell you how she ran that station, because it is the heart of why I'm telling any of this. She fixed the water first, found the spring fouled, paid a Mexican well-man named Ray's top dollar to clear it, and then kept him on at a wage that made him the most loyal hand in the territory. She rebuilt the barn with lumber she dressed down the price of by knowing exactly what good lumber cost, her father's daughter to the bone. She set her chair tracks of smooth plank from the house to the barn to the well to the corral, so she could go anywhere on the place faster than a walking man, and where she couldn't go she had Rays and the boys, and they jumped when she spoke because she was never once wrong about a horse or a hitch or an account. She kept the cleanest teams and the fastest changes on the whole Caldera line. A coach that pulled into Larkspur Crossing got fresh horses in under 4 minutes, watered, hitched, and rolling, and the drivers learned to look forward to the stop because the coffee was real, and the woman who ran the place treated them like men instead of male sacks. Inside 2 years, the company that had laughed at her was routing extra freight through the crossing on purpose. Inside 3, she'd added a second barn and was breaking and selling teams of her own. And there wasn't a stage man between here and the railhead who didn't know that the best-mannered horses on the road came off the Hartwell place. She did her own books, in a fast slanting hand, and they balanced to the penny. She hired men and fired men. She faced down a drunk teamster who took a horsewhip to one of her geldings, rolled herself right out into the lot, and told him in a voice like a dropped axe that he could leave on his own legs or be carried. And she had Rays and 2 others at her shoulders, and the teamster left on his legs. That was the not-so-awesome life. The town of Quillen went on pitying in their parlors over their coffee for 7 years. The poor Hartwell girl, such a waste. I'd ride out to the crossing maybe once a month, more for the coffee and the company than for any doctoring she needed, and I'd sit on her porch in the evening and watch the stages come and go like clockwork under her hand. And I'd think, there is the most alive person I know, and a whole town has decided to feel sorry for her, and not one of them has the first idea what they're feeling sorry about. Only thing she never spoke of was Reese. I tried once, the second year, gentle as I knew how. She set down her coffee and looked out at Hewitt Butte going purple in the dusk, and she said, "Doc, I waited a year and a half for that man with my whole heart. And then I quit waiting because waiting's a thing you do sitting still, and I was done sitting still." She said it without bitterness, which was somehow worse than bitterness. If he's dead, I won't dishonor him by being a sad story. And if he's alive, and here she'd stopped and turned her cup in her hands, and the only crack I ever saw in her showed for half a second. If he's alive, then he chose not to come back, and a man's choices are his own. Either way, the answer's the same. I've got a stage at 6. And she'd wheeled herself off to bed, and we never spoke of it again. So that is how things stood the morning of the spring I started with, when a rider came down the Caldera Road into Larkspur, crossing on a played-out claybank, and the whole story I'd thought was finished turned out to have a chapter left in it that none of us could have written. I was there by chance. I'd come out to set the broken wrist of one of her hands, a boy named Tully, no relation to the fork, who'd been fool enough to argue with a colt, and I was on the porch with my coffee when the claybank came in. The rider sat it like a man who'd been in the saddle so long he'd forgotten how to get out of it. Lean, burnt dark, a bad leg held stiff in the stirrup, and an old wound stiffness in how he turned his neck. He stopped at the edge of the lot the way a man stops at the edge of a thing he's afraid of, and he looked at the fine barn and the clean corral and the smart painted house and the crew of men working easy and quick. And I watched him try to make it fit whatever picture he'd carried up that road, and fail. I knew him. God help me, under 7 years of trail and trouble and a beard going gray too early, I knew him. I near dropped my cup. "Reese Calloway," I said. His head came around. "Doc Pell." His voice was a ruin, rusty from disuse the way a man's gets when he's ridden alone too long. "This still the Hartwell place. They told me in town," he stopped, swallowed. "They told me in town she was out here. They told me," and he couldn't finish that either, and I understood all at once what they'd told him in town. They'd told him the sad story, the crippled Hartwell girl and the cowboy who never came back. They'd handed him his own grief at the mercantile counter, garnished with pity, the way Quillen handed everybody everything. "They told you wrong," I said. "Whatever it was, son, they told you wrong. Get down off that poor horse before he dies under you." He got down. The bad leg near folded, and he caught himself on the stirrup and stood a moment with his forehead against the saddle, and I saw then how far he'd come and how hard, and that whatever had kept him 7 years had not been a lack of wanting to be here. But before I could say a word of it, a voice came across the lot that stopped us both. "Raise, that's the wrong collar on the bay. He'll be galled by Quillen, swap it." And Della came around the corner of the barn at a clip, working her wheels, a ledger in her lap and a pencil behind her ear and her sleeves rolled to the elbow, calling orders, queen of the whole quick clean enterprise, and she saw him. I have been a doctor 40 years, and I have seen the heart do things the books don't credit. I watched Della Hartwell's face in that moment, and I will not try to put all of it into words, because I'd cheapen it. I'll tell you only that the ledger slid off her lap into the dust, and she did not look down at it. Her hands had stopped on the rims. The whole bustling lot had gone quiet, the men feeling the change in the air the way stock feels weather coming, and there were just the two of them, 30 feet of swept dirt between them, 7 years wide. "Reese," she said, "just the name, steady." But I was close enough to hear the steadiness cost her everything she had. "Della." He took a step toward her and the bad leg dragged, and I watched him see the chair. I watched him truly see it, the wheels, the brake, what it meant, And I watched the thing the town had told him land on him all over again, except now it was real and in front of him, and the grief and the guilt of it bowed him like a green branch under snow. "Oh, Della. Oh, God, your legs. They told me you'd been hurt. I never knew. I never, if I'd known I'd have." He was coming toward her now, fast as the leg let him, and his hands were already out, already reaching. Every line of him gone to that old animal need to pick a hurt thing up and carry it. And his face was wet and breaking and full of 7 years of sorrow and 100 miles of horror at what he imagined her days had become. And Della Hartwell put up one flat hand and stopped him cold at arm's length. "Don't," she said. He stopped, stricken. "Don't you dare come at me with that face," she said, and her voice was low and even, and it carried to every man in that lot. "Don't you come back from the dead after 7 years and look at me like I'm something got run over in the road. I've run this station 6 years. I break the finest teams on the Caldera line. I employ 9 men, and I have never missed a payroll, and I balance my own books to the penny." She was breathing hard now, but her hand stayed up and her chin stayed level. "You want to weep over poor Della Hartwell? You can ride right back to Quillen. There's a whole town there will weep with you. Out here we've got a stage at 6. And she spun the chair in its own length, the way her father had built it to spin, and she rolled away from him toward the barn, and she called over her shoulder, not unkindly but not kindly either, "Raise. Get the man's horse some water and a stall. He looks like he's come a long way to a place he doesn't understand yet." She left him standing in the middle of the lot with his hands still half raised and nothing in them. I went to him. He was shaking. "Doc," he said. "Doc, I only meant." "I know what you meant," I told him. "That's the trouble. Come sit on the porch, son. You've a thing or two to learn before that woman'll have you, and the first of it is that she doesn't need carrying. Never did since the day Sam built that chair. Maybe especially not by a man who left." That last was hard, and I meant it to be. He flinched from it worse than from the leg. But he sat. And over the next while, with the stage coming and going and Della pointedly never once looking our way, he told me where the 7 years had gone, and it was its own hard story. The High Plains winter had been real. The wagon train caught out. The men lost. Reese half froze and his feet near gone and pulled through by a band of Shoshone who had no reason to bother and bothered anyway. By the time he was whole, the drive's money was gone with the men, and he was 1,000 miles from anywhere with nothing, which was worse than how he'd left. Then the war, which he didn't say much about and I didn't push, except that his leg had come from it and so had the stiffness in his neck and the quiet in him, and 4 years of it had gone by like one long bad night. He'd written, he swore he'd written from the plains and from camps and from a hospital in a city whose name he said like it tasted bad. And either the letters never got out or they're in a dead letter sack somewhere yet, because not a one reached Quillen after that first winter, and a man riding into silence for 7 years either quits or goes mad, and Reese, I think, had done a little of both. "I told myself she'd married," he said. "Some good man with land. I hope she had. I'd pray at nights that she'd forgot all about a fool with empty hands." He stared at his hands, which were not empty now, but only because they were knotted together so hard. "I swore if I ever got home I'd just look at her once from a distance, see she was happy and ride on and not trouble her. And then I came home and they told me," his voice went, "they told me she'd been broke down in a chair and alone all these years, and I thought it was my fault, all of it. I thought if I'd been here." "If you'd been here," I said, "she'd have got thrown by that colt just the same, because she'd have been gentling him just the same, because that's who she is and it's got nothing to do with you. And you'd have done exactly what you tried to do just now, come at her with your hands out, and she'd have stopped you exactly the same. Maybe she'd have forgiven a younger you faster. You're a stranger to her now, Reese. You went away a boy, and you've come back a sad-eyed man full of sorry. And the one thing on this earth Della Hartwell will not abide is being somebody's sorry." He was quiet a long while. The 6 o'clock stage rolled in and her crew swarmed it, and we watched her at the center of it, sharp and quick and lit up with the work, calling the changes, and the driver, a big grizzled man named Holt, leaned down off the box to share some joke with her, and she laughed that carrying laugh, and Reese watched her laugh and something in his ruined face changed. "She's not broke," he said slowly, wondering, like a man working out a sum that comes out wrong from what he was sure of. "Doc, she's not broke at all. She's running the whole." He couldn't finish. He didn't need to. The wrongness of 7 years was lifting off him, and underneath it was the plain, bright fact of her. And I watched him fall in love all over again, except this time with the woman and not the girl, and I thought, well, maybe. "No," I said, "she's not broke. The only thing broke in this story is what the town's been telling everybody, your own self included. Now, you want her, you'll have to court the woman who's there, not grieve the girl who isn't. You'll have to come at her with your hands down. Can you do that?" "I don't know how," he said, honest as a man can be. "Then you'll learn," I said. "Start by being useful and quiet and not sorry. There's a fork in the offside bench needs mending, and you used to be handy. Go ask Rays for tools. Don't ask her for a thing." He stayed. I'll not pretend it went smooth, because nothing true ever does. He stayed on as a hand she let him through Rays, never quite saying yes herself, and for the first week she was flint to him. She gave him the hard jobs and the dawn jobs, and she watched, I think, to see if he'd quit, because half her heart was sure he would, the way he had before. He didn't quit. The bad leg made some of the work slow, but he never let it make the work bad, and he was good with the green stock the way he'd always been, gentle and patient, and the half-broke colts that spooked at every shadow would settle for him, and Della watched that out of the corner of her eye and said nothing. The thaw, when it came the way it does on the Caldera Road, slow, and then all at once. The slow of it was 100 small things. It was him learning, without being told twice, to fall into step beside her chair instead of hovering over it, so they went down the plank tracks shoulder to wheel like two people walking, not a man and a burden. It was him bringing a problem to her, a lame horse, a soured account, and asking her judgment plain, man to boss, and taking her answer as the right one because it was. It was the evening she found he'd planed her chair tracks smooth where a frost heave had buckled them, not making a show of it, just fixing it the way her father would have. And she ran her wheels over the new smooth wood and stopped, and sat a moment, and I happened to be there, and saw her press the back of her hand quick against her mouth before she rolled on. It was the night the town came up in conversation, and Reese said, low, not knowing I could hear, "They told me you were a sad story, Della. The whole town, they've been telling it so long they believe it." And Della said, "I know." And Reese said, "It made me so mad I couldn't see, that they'd make you small. You're the least small thing I ever knew." And there was a long quiet, and then Della said, in a different voice than I'd heard her use in 7 years, "Took you long enough to figure that out, Calloway." And Reese said, "I'm slow, but I'm here." And neither of them said anything else for a while, and I took myself off the porch and gave them the dark. The all at once of it was the blizzard. It came down out of the north the first week of what should have been spring, the kind of late storm that kills men who have already put their winter coats away. The afternoon stage out of Quillen, Holt driving, 6 passengers, a woman and a babe among them, was due at the crossing at 4 and didn't come, and by 5 the snow was sideways and you couldn't see the barn from the house, and Della had every lamp in the place lit and hung in the windows like a row of small moons to guide them in, and still they didn't come. Holt would have pushed for the crossing, Della said. She was at the big front window in her chair with the storm howling against the glass, and she was not wringing her hands, she was figuring. He knows this stretch. If he's not here, he's stuck at the Tully Ford, the water will have backed up with the freeze, the team will have balked. He's a mile out, maybe less, with a woman and a baby freezing in that box. She turned the chair. Rays, the big sledge, and the spare team, the steady one, the Grays. Tom, every lantern and every blanket we own, and the coffee on to boil for when they're back. Reese. And here is the thing I want you to see, because it is the whole of it. She did not tell Reese to stay back. She did not spare him the bad leg or the hard ride. She looked at the one man there who knew the Tully Ford in the dark as well as she once had, the man who'd grown up crossing it beside her, and she said, "Reese, you're the only one here besides me who's pulled a stuck coach out of that ford in flood. You'll have to be my legs at the water's edge. I'll get us there and run the team. You'll go down to the coach and get the people and tell me what you find and do what I say when I say it. Can you do that? Stand at the water and be my hands." And Reese Calloway, who had ridden home 7 years to pick this woman up and carry her, looked at her in the lamplight and understood at last exactly what she was offering him, which was not to be carried and not to do the carrying but to be needed, side by side, as an equal in a hard thing. And his face came apart again, but it came apart with joy this time, not grief. "Yes," he said, "I can do that." They went out into the storm together. I will not tell you it was easy or that I wasn't half sick with fear the whole black hour they were gone, because I'm a doctor and I know what cold does, and I stood at that window and prayed. But I'll tell you how it was when they came back, because Holt told it after, all winter, in every saloon on the line, until it was the new story the road told about the Hartwell place, the true one that finally drowned the old false one. They'd found the coach axle deep in the iced-up ford, the team blown and balking, Holt half froze on the box, the woman with the baby buttoned inside her coat against her own skin. Della had backed her grays down to the water and held them rock steady in the wind with a hand a draft master would have envied, and Reese had gone down the frozen bank on his bad leg into the black water to the hip and gotten the passengers out one by one and up to the sledge. And the whole time he'd called the situation up to her. The angle of the coach, the set of the team, the depth of the water. And she'd called back the orders, when to take the strain, when to ease. How to swing the grays to break the ice from the wheels. And between her judgment up top and his hands down below they walked that coach out of the flood, and that whole load of people home through a storm that should by rights have killed them. Holt said it was the finest piece of teamster work he'd seen in 30 years on the box, and that he'd never in his life seen two people work so like one person, and that he didn't rightly know which of them to thank, the woman who couldn't get out of her chair or the man who couldn't have done a lick of it without her saying how. That was the answer, of course. You weren't meant to know which to thank, that was the whole point. They came in white with snow and blue with cold and laughing, the both of them, the wild high laugh of people who have stared something down and won. And I got everybody dry and dosed, and the baby pinked up fine and Holt thawed out by the stove. And in the middle of all of it I looked over and Reese had stopped in the doorway with the snow melting off him, just looking at Della as she barked happy orders and ladled coffee, and Della felt him looking and turned, and across that crowded warm room full of saved people, the two of them looked at each other, and there wasn't a stitch of pity left anywhere in it. Not a thread. Just two people who'd found out in the worst of a storm that together they were better than either of them was alone, which is the only true thing any marriage is ever built on. He asked her that night, after the passengers were bedded down and the lamps turned low. I wasn't meant to see, but the porch is the porch and an old doctor's slow to bed. He didn't get down on one knee. I think he knew by then better than that, knew it would have put his face above hers looking down, and he'd learned. He pulled a stool up beside her chair so they were level, eye to eye, and he took her two strong hands in his two cold ones, and I heard him say, low, "Della Hartwell, I came back here meaning to take care of you, and I had it backward, and I'm sorry for it, and it's the last sorry I'll ever say to you. I don't want to take care of you. I want to stand at the water's edge and be your hands when you need hands, and let you be the sense in my head when I haven't got any, and run this crossing beside you till we're both too old to lift a collar. I haven't got land. I've still got empty hands, but they're yours if you'll have them, and I'll never leave them empty again." And Della Hartwell, who had not waited for any man in 7 years because waiting was a thing you did sitting still, Della, who'd built an awesome life out of the wreck a whole town pitied, who needed nothing and no one, looked at the man she'd loved since before either of them knew the word, and she chose him. Freely. Not because she was lonely and not because she was less. Because she wanted him, which is the only reason worth a thing. It took you 7 years and a blizzard, Calloway, she said, but you finally came at me with your hands down. And she laughed and he laughed and she said, yes, God help me, yes. They married in the early summer, out at the crossing, in the swept lot where she'd first stopped him cold. Half the Caldera line shut down for the day to come. Holt gave the bride away, you might say, in that he drove the empty box up special and stood beside her chair with his hat over his heart and bawled like a baby through the vows. And the town of Quillen came too, the same good souls who'd pitied her 7 years, and I watched their faces as they finally understood the size of what they'd been condescending to. And I won't say it wasn't a satisfaction to me, an old man's small, mean satisfaction, to see them learn it. She kept her own name on the patents and the deed and the brand, by the by, the way she'd kept it all along. Hartwell Horses off the Larkspur place. Reese never once asked her to change it, and I think loved her the more for never offering. They ran that crossing near 30 years, the best station on the road to the end of it, and broke the finest teams in the territory, and raised 2 children who grew up thinking it was the most ordinary thing in the world that their mother ran the whole show from a chair their grandfather's hands had built, because it was ordinary in that house. It was just the truth. Della passed first, an old woman in her sleep in the spring, which she'd have called fair, having been thrown in a spring all those years before the road comes round. Reese asked me to come out after, and I did, and I found him sitting on a stool pulled up beside her empty chair, holding the worn rims where her 2 strong hands had held them 30 years, and he wasn't weeping, quite. He was just sitting level beside it, the way he'd learned to where her eyes had been. They had it all wrong, Doc, he said to me, not turning. The whole town, all those years, the not-so-awesome life. He ran his thumb along the smooth ash her father had bent. It was the awesomest life I ever saw. I just got to stand at the edge of it and be her hands a while. That was the whole of my luck. That was everything I ever had. I have set a great many bones in this valley and buried my share, and I am an old man now myself. And when I think on all of it, that is the mourning I keep. The cowboy come home sure he'd find her broken, standing in the lot with his hands out, and the woman who put up one flat palm and stopped him, and made him learn, the hard, slow, blizzard-broke way, that the only thing ever broken in the whole of it was what the town kept saying. She was never the sad story. She was the best story the Caldera Road ever told, and the bravest thing that fool of a cowboy ever did, braver than the Ford and the war and the High Plains winter all put together, was finally to put his hands down and let her be exactly as awesome as she'd always been.